The soldiers at the doorway did not wait for permission to enter, and Gaius Julius Caesar felt his pulse hammer against his ribs as he rose to meet them. Their cloaks were marked with the authority of Sulla, and men marked by Sulla had already vanished from Rome without appeal. As the officer delivered the demand that he divorce Cornelia, Caesar's mouth went dry and he calculated the narrow path in front of him. Submit and live under permanent humiliation, or refuse and risk execution under prescription. He heard himself refuse before the tremor left his hands. Cornelia was the daughter of Cinna, a political enemy of the dictator, and marriage to her made Caesar suspect in a city purging its past. Relatives urged him to comply, speaking in careful tones about survival and the futility of pride against absolute power. Caesar listened without interrupting, measuring how obedience would brand him as pliable in every future contest. If he surrendered her to save himself, he would teach Rome how far he could be bent. Sulla stripped him of priesthood and of inheritance, tightening pressure without yet delivering a fatal blow. Caesar moved through Italy in concealment, weakened by illness and dependent on friends who risked their own safety to shelter him. Each knock in the night forced a fresh calculation of whether stubbornness justified the danger closing around him. When a pardon finally came through intermediaries, it arrived not as mercy but as warning, and he returned to Rome carrying the lesson that defiance, carefully timed, could preserve standing even against a dictator. He did not cast Cornelia aside when danger passed. She remained at his side through the lean years that followed, a living reminder that he had once chosen risk over obedience. When she died in 69 BC, while he was serving abroad, Caesar returned and insisted on delivering her funeral oration himself, reviving the memory of her father's faction before a crowd that had learned to stay cautious. The gesture was unnecessary for advancement and provocative in its symbolism. He made it anyway. Even in grief, he refused to signal retreat from loyalties that had nearly destroyed him. After Cornelia's death, he remarried with calculation rather than romance. Pompeia, granddaughter of Sulla, linked him to the very faction that had once hunted him, a union that cooled old hostilities without requiring apology. When scandal erupted during the rites of the Bona Dea, and a young aristocrat was discovered inside his home in disguise, Caesar did not argue publicly or defend her innocence. He divorced her at once, stating that his household must stand beyond suspicion. The decision was swift and unsentimental. Reputation, he had decided, could not be allowed to bleed. He sought distance from immediate reprisal by serving in Asia, where risk was measured in arrows and siege ladders rather than denunciations. At Mytilene, he advanced under fire to save fellow soldiers, earning the civic crown that required senators to rise when he entered the chamber. The honor altered how older men looked at him, and he registered the shift with quiet attention. Visible courage, publicly certified, created leverage that accusation alone could not erase. Back in Rome, he studied the appetite of the crowd as closely as he had studied enemy walls, noting how spectacle redirected frustration and how gratitude lingered after expense was forgotten. Lacking inherited wealth on the scale of his rivals, he borrowed heavily to finance games that flooded the city with color, exotic beasts, and carefully staged generosity. Creditors tracked his obligations with cold precision, aware that failure would leave him exposed. Caesar accepted the risk because debt could be renegotiated, but obscurity could not. As a dial, he restored trophies of Marius to public view, reviving a name long suppressed, and watched how veterans responded with open approval while conservatives stiffened in resentment. The gesture tied him unmistakably to a political lineage that had suffered defeat, yet it also signaled that he would not erase inconvenient loyalties for acceptance. Every display was a wager that popularity would outpace backlash. He treated reputation as armor forged in public memory. Advancement required more than applause, and Caesar turned toward men whose rivalry threatened to fracture the state. Pompey commanded prestige and soldiers. Crassus controlled immense wealth. Each distrusted the other enough to block cooperation. Caesar offered himself as the hinge between them, proposing a private compact that would synchronize their ambitions against senatorial obstruction. By aligning their interests, he converted isolation into collective dominance without altering a single written law. The agreement that followed, later called the First Triumvirate, did not dissolve the Republic, yet it redirected its currents through coordinated pressure. With Pompey's veterans awaiting land grants and Crassus expecting favorable measures, Caesar entered the consulship armed with mutual obligations that constrained resistance. Opposition did not disappear, but it became fragmented. He had learned that institutions yielded when confronted by unified self-interest. As consul, he advanced agrarian reforms despite procedural resistance, bypassing obstruction in the Senate by appealing directly to the assemblies. When a colleague attempted to halt proceedings through religious pretexts, Caesar pressed forward, forcing votes while Pompey's presence signaled consequences for delay. The chamber seethed and denunciations multiplied, yet legislation passed. Procedure had been tested and found pliable under sustained pressure. Resistance hardened outside the chamber, and accusations of illegality gathered momentum that could mature into prosecution once his term ended. Caesar responded not with retreat, but with a calculated departure, securing a proconsular command in Gaul for an extended period that granted both military authority and temporary immunity. The provinces promised danger and distance, but they also offered legions loyal to their commander. He recognized that armed success could insulate him from courtroom vulnerability more effectively than rhetoric. Before leaving Rome, he confronted creditors demanding assurance and rivals predicting collapse, yet his focus narrowed to the opportunities beyond the Alps. Victory in Gaul would silence detractors and bind soldiers to his person through shared hardship and reward. Failure would leave him bankrupt and exposed to charges waiting in the capital. If you want to follow how calculated risk transforms into a force that can bend a republic toward war, subscribe and like the video, because from this departure forward, every campaign will deepen both his power and Rome's fear. When he crossed into his assigned provinces, the decision was not merely administrative, it was protective. Gaul represented a battlefield where reputation could be rebuilt on a scale large enough to overshadow domestic enemies. He understood that moderation would not suffice. The path upward required escalation. Caesar's first winter in Gaul did not feel like a triumph, because the maps in his tent were mostly empty space, and the men beyond his pickets did not yet fear his name. The air bit through wool, and he kept his cloak on even indoors, not from comfort, but to hide how tightly he was gripping the edge of the table. Rome was far away, and so were the courts that waited for him if he returned without glory. Yet the danger here was simpler and more immediate. A misstep in alien territory, a legion cut off, a reputation destroyed before it could harden into protection. He spoke calmly to his officers while running the numbers in his head, knowing that survival depended on making the first violence decisive. The Helvetii began to move, a mass migration that could become an invasion, and Caesar understood that delay would advertise weakness to every tribe watching the frontier. He marched hard, bridges thrown over rivers under pressure, then struck with enough speed that the campaign felt like a verdict rather than a battle. Bodies and wagons clogged the crossings, and his soldiers, exhausted, kept moving because he did not allow them the luxury of stopping. Each victory was not only territory gained, but a message sent back to Rome in dispatches, carefully written to make necessity look like inevitability. When the German king Ariovistus threatened Roman allies, Caesar treated the challenge as an opportunity that could not be purchased with money in the forum. He demanded a meeting, watched the German cavalry circle like predators, and kept his face neutral as his own men tightened their formation without being told. The negotiations soured quickly, and as the threat turned into open hostility, Caesar shifted from diplomacy to attack with an abruptness that signaled control. He won, and the legions learned the habit of trusting his judgment under pressure because he never asked them to endure uncertainty longer than necessary. By the second year, he was not merely defending allies. He was shaping Gaul to fit his needs, choosing enemies that would yield the clearest rewards. He drove into the lands of the Belgae, tribes known for ferocity, and when the fighting turned desperate, he put himself where the line bent, forcing his presence to become the pivot of the battle. The mud sucked at sandals, shields splintered, and he watched men glance toward him in the moments before they either broke or held. He could feel loyalty being forged in exhaustion, and he calculated that this loyalty would outlast any legal argument made against him in Rome. Each season widened his reach, and with it, the scale of the risk, because a commander who must always win cannot afford a single mistake. He crossed the Rhine not because Rome demanded it, but because fear demanded it, building a bridge in days as if engineering itself were another weapon. He led soldiers onto foreign soil, then withdrew, leaving behind the impression that no boundary could protect those who resisted him. The act was spectacle with consequences, and he knew exactly how it would sound when recited aloud in the Senate. Then he pointed his ships toward Britain, a place that existed more as rumor than province, and he accepted the possibility of disaster for the certainty of astonishment. Storms scattered vessels, tides exposed his men to attack on unfamiliar beaches, and for a moment, the sea itself seemed like a rival stronger than any tribe. Caesar watched the hesitation ripple along the landing line and made a visible adjustment, moving where he could be seen, forcing motion to replace doubt. He returned without conquest, but not without profit, because the story of reaching the edge of the world traveled faster than any critic. The victories multiplied, and so did the burden, because his enemies began to understand that the only way to stop him was to make him bleed. In the winter camps, when legions were spread out for supplies, the Eburones rose under Ambiorix and destroyed a Roman force through deception, an insult that could not be ignored. Caesar's reaction was contained but immediate. His orders clipped, his jaw set so hard it ached, because he calculated that mercy now would be interpreted as weakness everywhere. He hunted the rebels with a methodical harshness that turned punishment into warning, and the legions watched him become colder without announcing any change. The final resistance gathered under Vercingetorix, a leader who understood Rome's strength and chose to fight it by burning his own land rather than feeding its armies. Caesar pursued into central Gaul as supplies tightened and allies wavered, and he felt how quickly momentum could turn when hunger and fatigue replaced confidence. At Gergovia, he suffered a reverse, a rare check that cost men and threatened the aura he had built with careful speed. He did not explain it away, he absorbed it, recalculating how to force a decisive engagement that would erase doubt before it could spread. He drove toward Alesia and trapped Vercingetorix inside, then did something that revealed the scale of his ambition and the brittleness of his position. He chose to fight two wars at once. Caesar ordered fortifications not only to keep the besieged in, but also to keep relieving armies out, building rings of earthworks that turned the landscape into a weapon. The work never stopped, even as arrows fell and hands blistered, because he understood that if the walls failed, everything failed: his command, his immunity, his future. He walked the lines, speaking to centurions, watching for the smallest signs of panic as the Gauls gathered outside in numbers that made the horizon look crowded. The relief forces attacked in waves, and the pressure became physical, a sensation of being slowly crushed between two jaws. Caesar responded by shifting reserves at the moments where collapse threatened, committing cavalry where a gap opened, then appearing personally where the fighting turned most dangerous. Dust coated his mouth, and he forced himself to breathe through it, calculating how long men could endure before their bodies decided for them. When the final assault came and the line bent toward breaking, He made his most visible act of control, driving forward with reinforcements so the soldiers could see that retreat was not an option he was willing to permit. The next day, Vercingetorix surrendered, and the victory was complete enough to feel unreal, as if the world had briefly agreed to Caesar's will. The Gallic leader rode out in full display, then dismounted and yielded himself, and Caesar watched without softness because he understood what this victory meant back in Rome. It was not only territory secured, it was an army that now believed it could win against impossible odds as long as he commanded it. Destiny was a word other men used, but he behaved as if it were a resource he had earned and could spend. While he won in Gaul, the balance that kept him safe in Rome began to rot. Crassus, the wealthy pillar of the triumvirate, sought glory in the east and died in disaster, and Caesar felt the political architecture shift as if a support beam had been kicked away. The alliance had worked because it prevented any single rival from claiming the Republic's full attention, but now the rivalry narrowed. With Crassus gone, only Pompey remained as a counterweight strong enough to be turned into an enemy. Pompey did not need to declare war. He only needed to stop needing Caesar. In Rome, senators who feared Caesar's rising power courted Pompey as the lawful defender of order, and Pompey allowed it, letting his dignity become a shield for their anxiety. Caesar read reports that sounded polite yet carried threat, hearing in them the suggestion that his victories were no longer admired, but resented. He began to sense that he was being defined not as a servant of Rome, but as a danger to it. And once that definition took hold, his options would narrow to violence or submission. He answered with messages of loyalty and legality, insisting he had acted for the Republic, but he did not slow his accumulation of strength because he understood how quickly legality could be rewritten by those who controlled the city. Every triumph he announced increased the fear of the men who had to vote on his future. He was still far away, still surrounded by soldiers who loved him, yet the ground under his political position in Rome was shifting. The more he won, the more he made it difficult for Rome to imagine him returning as an ordinary citizen. The letter from Rome was read aloud in the lamplight, and Caesar kept his face still as the words settled over the tent like dust after a collapse. The Senate ordered him to disband his legions and return as a private citizen to stand trial, accusations already prepared by men who had waited years for this moment. He felt heat rise along his neck despite the winter air, and he calculated the sequence that would follow obedience. Surrender command, enter the city without immunity, face charges that could strip him of property, dignity, and perhaps freedom. The decree did not threaten his life openly, but it threatened everything that made survival worth preserving. The charges were not yet formal, yet they were predictable. Illegal warfare, abuse of office, excessive force. And Caesar knew that guilt in Rome often followed political convenience rather than evidence. His enemies did not need to prove wrongdoing. They needed only to isolate him from his army and let procedure finish what rivalry had begun. He listened as messengers described the debates, hearing not law, but choreography. If he crossed the Pomerium without protection, he would be at the mercy of men who feared him more than they respected precedent. He responded first with restraint, proposing that both he and Pompey lay down their commands simultaneously, a gesture that would preserve balance while protecting him from singular vulnerability. The proposal was calculated to appear moderate, yet it also exposed the core truth that he would not disarm alone. When the Senate rejected the compromise under pressure from hardliners, the refusal narrowed the field of acceptable outcomes. Caesar's jaw tightened as he realized that fairness was no longer the point. Submission was. Then came the news that shifted the ground beneath him. Pompey had been granted emergency powers to defend the state. The title carried legality, and with it the authority to raise troops in Italy, to command resources, to define opposition as rebellion. Caesar absorbed the implication in silence, fingers drumming once against the map before going still. The Republic had chosen its champion, and it was not him. He pictured Pompey in Rome, surrounded by senators who had once courted his favor, but now whispered about his ambition as if it were contagion. They spoke of liberty, of ancestral custom, of the danger posed by a single man commanding loyal legions beyond the Alps. Caesar understood how easily those arguments could be sharpened into warrants. If Pompey consolidated lawful force while he hesitated, the balance would tip beyond recovery. Reports arrived of tribunes sympathetic to him being threatened and eventually fleeing the city, an act that suggested debate had given way to intimidation. Caesar seized on their expulsion as proof that constitutional norms were already compromised, yet he did not announce fury. He recalculated. The legality of his position mattered less than the perception of injustice he could claim. If Rome could be convinced that he acted to defend rights rather than seize power, the moral terrain might remain contested. Still, the personal risk remained immediate and stark. To obey the decree meant walking into a courtroom where verdict and humiliation were likely prearranged, and he could almost feel the weight of hostile stares as charges were read. Exile would follow, or worse, and his enemies would parade the outcome as proof that the Republic had defended itself. He imagined the silence that would fall over his name, replaced by a cautionary tale. Within his camp, the legions waited for clarity, their loyalty proven in Gaul, but not yet tested against Rome itself. Officers sought private audiences, speaking carefully about honor, legality, and the oaths they had sworn. Caesar listened more than he spoke, watching their faces for doubt, because any fracture would become fatal once exposed. He knew that asking them to follow him into conflict against fellow Romans would redefine every bond he had built. At the edge of Italy, near the narrow river that marked the boundary of his lawful command, he convened a small circle of trusted commanders. The night air carried the scent of damp earth, and torches flickered against armor polished for inspection rather than battle. Caesar laid out the facts without ornament: disband and face trial, or advance and be declared an enemy of the state. The words did not tremble, but the choice behind them carried the weight of irreversibility. He considered the arithmetic in silence after they dispersed, standing alone long enough that even his closest aides kept their distance. If he surrendered, he preserved the fiction of republican order at the cost of his own safety and standing. If he advanced, he would shatter that order and stake everything on speed, loyalty, and fear. There would be no partial measures. Once a legion crossed into Italy under his command, retreat would be impossible without disgrace or destruction. He ran through the likely responses. Cities might resist, or they might open their gates. Pompey might consolidate quickly, or he might misjudge the tempo. The one certainty was that delay favored his enemies, because law moves slowly until it decides to move all at once. Caesar felt the old lesson from Sulla's Rome press against his memory. Power does not forgive vulnerability displayed at the wrong moment. The Republic had summoned him to stand trial, but the summons felt less like an invitation than a trap, and he understood that whatever he chose next would redefine not only his fate, but Rome's. The river was narrow enough to step across in places, yet Caesar felt his throat constrict as if it were an ocean. The Rubicon marked the boundary of his lawful command, and beyond it lay Italy, where a general entering under arms became an enemy by definition. He sat on horseback in the cold dusk, listening to the restless shifting of the 13th Legion behind him, and calculated the two outcomes left: cross and ignite war, or turn back and submit to men who had prepared charges to ruin him. His hand tightened on the reins before he gave the order to advance. The first standards moved through the shallow water, boots breaking the surface with soft splashes that sounded louder than any trumpet. Caesar followed, not hurried, but without hesitation, because hesitation would ripple backward into doubt. In that moment, the old protections of office and procedure dissolved, replaced by a fact that could not be argued away. He had chosen force over summons. Whatever language would later justify it, The act itself was irreversible. He addressed the soldiers not as conspirators, but as defenders of their rights, framing the march as protection against injustice rather than rebellion. The tribunes who had fled Rome stood beside him, visible proof that he could claim grievance as well as ambition. Caesar watched the faces in the torchlight, measuring whether loyalty would survive the word civil. No one stepped out of line. Speed became his shield. He drove south before resistance could consolidate, moving faster than rumor, so that towns received news of his approach only hours before his arrival. Ariminum opened its gates with minimal protest, and Caesar entered not as a besieger, but as a magistrate asserting authority, careful to forbid looting and unnecessary violence. Discipline was not mercy, it was strategy. Italian cities weighed their options in real time, calculating whether loyalty to the Senate justified risking destruction for a cause not yet embodied by an army in their streets. Caesar's advance forced the calculation to favor survival, and one by one municipalities offered provisions rather than barricades. Each surrender expanded his momentum while shrinking the psychological space in which Pompey could maneuver. He understood that war at this stage was a contest of perception as much as steel. In Rome, panic outran information. Senators who had demanded firmness now faced the reality of legions advancing toward the capital, and their confidence thinned under the pressure of immediacy. Pompey had authority, but not readiness. His forces were scattered, and time favored the aggressor. Caesar counted on that imbalance, pressing forward before organization could harden into resistance. He issued proclamations insisting he sought reconciliation, offering again the proposal that both he and Pompey lay down arms simultaneously. The offer was designed to sound reasonable, while his legions secured positions that made refusal costly. Caesar did not need immediate battle. He needed the image of a man compelled to act by others' obstinacy. Each message sent south was a calculated layer in that construction. Pompey chose withdrawal over confrontation, evacuating Rome with many senators rather than risk engagement with incomplete forces. The decision stunned those who had believed authority alone could halt Caesar's progress. When word reached Caesar that the capital stood effectively abandoned, he paused only long enough to assess the advantage. Control of Rome would grant him treasury access and symbolic dominance, but it would not erase the accusation of illegality. He entered the city without bloodshed, presenting himself as restorer of order rather than conqueror. Yet the empty benches in the Senate House exposed the fracture. Power without universal acknowledgement felt unstable, and Caesar knew that legitimacy could not be seized as easily as territory. Pompey and his allies regrouped in the east, gathering fleets and legions beyond his immediate reach. The conflict had expanded from a march to a Mediterranean reckoning. Within Rome, Caesar moved quickly to secure funds and authorize further command, ensuring that his position would not collapse if momentum faltered. He avoided mass reprisals, calculating that restraint would blunt resistance and preserve the narrative of necessity. At the same time, he prepared for a campaign against Pompey that would decide whether his gamble had been audacity or ruin. There was no path back to private life. As winter tightened its grip, Caesar stood in the Forum and felt the weight of what he had unleashed. The Republic still existed in form, yet its most sacred boundary had been crossed by one of its own magistrates under arms. He had forced the crisis into the open, compelling every citizen to choose alignment rather than comfort. The march south had given him control of Italy, but it had not delivered finality. Across the Adriatic, Pompey consolidated strength among governors and kings who feared Caesar's rise more than they feared civil war. Reports of new levies and alliances reached Rome with steady rhythm, reminding Caesar that speed alone would not end the struggle. He studied maps of Greece and the eastern provinces, calculating distances, supply lines, and the morale of troops who would soon face former comrades. Victory would need to be decisive enough to silence doubts that still lingered in every proclamation. He had crossed a river to avoid a trial, and in doing so had transformed political rivalry into open war. The gamble had brought him to the center of power, yet it also bound his survival to outcomes he could not fully control. Italy lay under his authority, but the Republic was now split between competing claims to legitimacy. The next confrontation would determine whether his defiance secured dominance or convinced Rome that only his destruction could restore its balance. The plain near Pharsalus shimmered in the heat, and Caesar could see Pompey's army stretched wide across the horizon, deeper in numbers and heavier in confidence. Dust clung to his tongue as he studied the enemy lines, calculating the imbalance. Pompey held more infantry, more cavalry, and the Senate's formal blessing, while he held veterans hardened by Gaul, and a momentum that could not survive a drawn-out stalemate. If he lost here, there would be no negotiated exile, no quiet retirement. There would be condemnation, pursuit, and erasure. Pompey chose high ground and patience, expecting hunger and time to weaken Caesar's smaller force. Caesar refused that script. He thinned his own lines to match the enemy's breadth, concealing a fourth line of infantry behind his cavalry to blunt the anticipated flanking assault. The adjustment was subtle but decisive, and he watched his officers absorb it without question, because the hesitation would infect the ranks faster than fear. When the battle opened, Pompey's cavalry surged against Caesar's right, confident that superiority would shatter resistance in minutes. Caesar gave the signal, and the hidden cohorts lunged forward, not throwing javelins, but thrusting upward into faces and exposed limbs, turning the charge into chaos. The shock rippled through Pompey's horsemen, and what had been an advantage collapsed into retreat. Caesar felt the shift like a physical change in the air. The infantry clash that followed was brutal and compressed, shields grinding, men slipping on churned earth as formations strained to hold cohesion. Caesar moved along the line where pressure built, issuing clipped commands, showing himself where doubt threatened to open gaps. He measured the tempo of exhaustion, knowing that the side which broke rhythm first would break entirely. When Pompey's line faltered, Caesar committed his reserves without hesitation. The collapse came unevenly, then all at once. Pompey's soldiers began to withdraw toward their camp, and withdrawal turned into flight under relentless pursuit. Caesar ordered restraint once victory was assured, calculating that magnanimity would serve him better than slaughter. The field belonged to him. Pompey did not wait to be captured. He fled east toward Egypt, seeking support and distance, while Caesar secured the camp and counted the cost of triumph. Senators who had aligned against him now stood exposed, and he faced a choice between vengeance and reconciliation. He chose selective clemency, believing that mercy would bind former enemies more effectively than terror, yet he understood that mercy also advertised supreme confidence. He followed Pompey across the Mediterranean, unwilling to leave a rival alive to reorganize resistance. Storms slowed the voyage, and supplies thinned, yet he pressed on because unfinished business invited future war. When he reached Alexandria, he did not receive a negotiation. He received a gift meant to flatter him. Pompey had been murdered by local authorities, hoping to earn favor. The severed head was presented as proof of loyalty, and for a moment Caesar's composure fractured, his expression tightening before he mastered it. Pompey had been his ally, then his rival, and now he was a corpse delivered for approval. Caesar turned away, issuing orders for proper burial rites, calculating that public outrage at the killing would distance him from the act. Yet the message was clear. Rivals vanished through blood, and the world was adjusting to his ascendancy. Egypt itself became a battleground, as dynastic disputes drew him into urban warfare, forcing him to defend his position amid fire and shifting alliances. He navigated the palace corridors with the same intensity he had shown on open fields, aware that defeat here would unravel the aura built at Pharsalus. Reinforcements arrived just in time and he secured control, but the campaign exposed how thin his margins could become far from Italy. Victory required constant motion. From Egypt, he moved to Asia Minor, where a swift campaign crushed resistance with startling speed, reinforcing the image of inevitability that he carefully cultivated. Each rapid success tightened his grip on the narrative that opposition was futile. Yet pockets of senatorial resistance remained in Africa and Spain, rallying under commanders who refused to accept his dominance. Caesar prepared to finish the war, not because he relished pursuit, but because incomplete victories invited conspiracy. In Africa, he faced seasoned leaders and forces bolstered by Numidian cavalry, and the fighting demanded the same precision that had carried him through Gaul. He absorbed setbacks without public frustration, recalculating formations and exploiting weaknesses until resistance buckled. In Spain, he confronted Pompey's sons, who sought to inherit both their father's cause and his legitimacy. The battles were fierce and personal, and when they ended in Caesar's favor, the organized senatorial armies ceased to exist. By the time he returned toward Rome, there were no field armies left capable of challenging him openly. The Mediterranean had been forced into alignment through speed, calculation, and an unwillingness to leave rivals breathing space. Yet the summit he approached was narrow and exposed. Absolute victory meant that any future opposition would not gather in legions but in whispers and daggers. He had avoided prosecution by choosing war, and he had survived war by refusing half measures. Pompey was dead, his heirs defeated, and the Senate's military resistance shattered, but the Republic's memory still lingered in the men who had lost. Caesar rode back toward the capital not as a defendant, but as the unchallenged master of Roman arms, aware that supremacy achieved through civil conflict demanded constant vigilance. There was no longer an equal to negotiate with. Only subjects and the possibility that some would not accept that role. Rome greeted Caesar with ceremonies that felt both triumphant and wary, as if the city were applauding while keeping a hand near a knife. He moved through the streets beneath laurel and shouted praises, yet he tracked the faces that did not fully soften, the senators who clapped with measured rhythm and never met his eyes for long. Victory had brought him home, but home was no longer neutral ground. He could feel how quickly admiration could turn into fear if he gave it a name. He had married again by then, choosing Calpurnia, daughter of a powerful consul whose loyalty strengthened his position inside the Senate. The marriage carried none of the drama of earlier unions. It was deliberate, stabilizing, and politically efficient. Calpurnia did not anchor him to a faction of the defeated past or expose him to scandal. She reinforced the structure he was building. Even his household now reflected consolidation rather than defiance. He began by taking offices that could be presented as temporary necessities, accepting appointment as dictator to restore order, then resigning when immediate tasks were completed. The pattern looked respectful of tradition, and Caesar understood the value of that appearance because each resignation made the next appointment easier to justify. Yet the repetition also trained Rome to accept that only he could stabilize the state. He did not say it aloud. He made it the city's habit. He pushed reforms with the speed of a man who no longer believed time would tolerate hesitation. Debts were adjusted. Colonies planned for veterans, and the calendar itself was reformed to correct drift that had embarrassed administrators for years. These changes created practical relief, but they also demonstrated that the normal pace of Republican bargaining had been replaced by decree and direction. Caesar watched results appear, and he treated results as proof that concentration of power was not corruption, but efficiency. Appointments shifted too as he elevated supporters and expanded the Senate's ranks, diluting the influence of hostile families by adding men who owed their status to him. The chamber grew larger and less coherent, and Caesar's authority inside it became less contested because contest required unity. He redistributed magistracies and priesthoods as if assigning tools, building a network of obligation that wrapped around the city's institutions. Each promotion was a quiet reminder that advancement flowed from his favor. Still, his position rested on a formal contradiction. The Republic claimed to reject kings, yet Rome now depended on one man to command armies, set policy, and decide who could safely return from exile. Caesar tried to soften the contradiction through generosity and spectacle, staging triumphs that displayed captured wealth and foreign submission. Crowds roared, and he calculated that public satisfaction could smother elite resentment for a time. But he also sensed the resentment shifting rather than dissolving, retreating from open opposition into private calculation. The turning point came when the city offered him permanence, presenting repeated dictatorships as if they were honors rather than admissions of dependence. Caesar accepted extensions, and with each acceptance, the gap between emergency and normality narrowed further. The power shift was subtle in paperwork, but loud in implication. The Republic's most extreme office was becoming routine. When the title dictator for life was offered, it arrived dressed as gratitude and stability, and Caesar took it as if refusal would appear theatrical or weak. He understood that stepping back could invite renewed chaos and renewed prosecutions against his allies, and he had come too far to pretend neutrality again. Acceptance locked his authority into the future, turning his dominance from a wartime solution into a constitutional fact. The act did not require violence, yet it carried the force of finality. After that, honors began to pile up in ways that no single mind could fully control. Statues appeared beside those of gods and ancestors, his image stamped on coinage, his chair placed among sacred seats, and the calendar itself bent around his name. Caesar received these tributes with practiced restraint, yet he registered how each one widened the distance between him and the men expected to share governance. In Rome, distance was dangerous because it made fear easier than familiarity. Rumors of kingship spread with the logic of panic, and Caesar's enemies learned to let the rumor speak for them. The word rex carried ancient disgust, and once it surfaced, even supporters became careful, anxious not to appear complicit. Caesar tried to manage perception by refusing a crown when it was theatrically offered in public, but refusal could not erase the fact that the offer existed at all. Each performance, designed to calm suspicion, also reminded Rome that monarchy was now a topic, not a memory. He continued to meet the Senate, yet the meetings shifted in tone because deference replaced argument. Men rose when he entered, votes aligned quickly, and dissent grew rare, not because consensus had been achieved, but because consequences were understood. Caesar read the silence as cooperation, and that interpretation blinded him to the bitterness collecting beneath courtesy. He was surrounded by formal submission, yet he was increasingly alone in genuine conversation. The city's elite adjusted their behavior, learning to flatter without committing, to agree without trusting, and to speak in private with a different edge than they used in public. Caesar sensed the change in small details, the pause before certain greetings, the way some men watched him from the side rather than the front, the way laughter thinned when he approached. He responded by tightening his circle, relying more on loyal veterans and longtime allies, which only deepened the impression that the Republic had been replaced by a household court. Isolation became both his protection and his vulnerability. At the same time, Caesar planned campaigns beyond Rome, speaking openly of Eastern wars and future conquests as if movement itself could keep pressure from settling inward. He was most comfortable when risk lay ahead, when the next operation could be solved through command rather than compromise. Yet every plan to leave the city created a new anxiety among senators, who wondered what Rome would become when the dictator for life departed with the army. The title that promised stability also made absence terrifying. He could not retreat without appearing to admit wrongdoing, and he could not advance without feeding the belief that the Republic no longer existed except as a stage set. Caesar stood at the summit of power, surrounded by honors that felt heavy rather than light, and he continued to act with confident momentum because slowing might reveal how fragile his position truly was. The city obeyed him, yet obedience was no longer the same as acceptance. Somewhere behind the applause and the formal votes, men were beginning to decide what form of violence could end, what law could not. The whispers did not reach Caesar as warnings, because they moved through the rooms he no longer needed to enter. In porticos and private dining rooms, senators spoke of liberty with careful intensity, rehearsing the claim that assassination was not murder but surgery, a cut to save the body of the state. Caesar felt only the surface of it. An unusual stiffness in greetings, a politeness that required effort, a handful of faces that watched him too steadily. Yet he continued to act as if opposition would announce itself in the open. The conspiracy thrived in that gap between his confidence and their fear. Men who had once begged for pardon now met without him, binding themselves through oaths that could not be undone without betrayal. They told one another that waiting meant surrendering Rome permanently, that the dictator's next campaign would leave them trapped beneath an unanswerable monarchy. Each participant took a risk that could not be shared with the public until the EE Act was complete, because failure meant execution and confiscation. The plan hardened around a single moment, a Senate meeting in a place that would feel lawful, where he would arrive unarmored and exposed. On the morning of the Ides, Calpurnia woke shaken from a dream in which she saw his statue running with blood and Rome crumbling around it. She urged him not to attend the Senate, her hands tight at his sleeve as she pressed the warning with unusual insistence. For a moment he agreed to delay, calculating whether absence would signal caution or weakness. Then word came that the senators waited and would interpret hesitation as fear. He changed his decision. The balance between omen and image tipped toward appearance. On the morning of the Ides of March, Caesar moved through routine as if the day carried no special weight. He was delayed, stalled by petitions and the small machinery of governance, and that delay tightened the conspirators' nerves more than it protected him. He adjusted his schedule with a practiced ease, calculating that the Senate could wait because the Senate now waited for him. The air held a faint chill, and he kept his toga drawn close as he walked. At the theater of Pompey, the setting carried its own insult, a reminder of the rival he had defeated and outlived. Senators rose as he entered, the gesture polished and automatic, and Caesar read the movement as deference rather than tension. He took his seat, accepting the proximity of men who had applauded him for years and now hid steel beneath their sleeves. There were no guards at his shoulders, because a ruler who required guards inside the Senate announced fear, and Caesar would not announce fear. The first approach looked like a petition, bodies closing in under the pretense of pleading. Caesar leaned forward slightly, listening, and a hand caught at his toga as if to hold him in place. His reflex was irritation rather than alarm, a brief tightening at the corner of his mouth as he prepared to reject the intrusion. Then the first blade struck. Pain flared sharp and surprising, more disbelief than agony in the first instant, and his breath caught as his body tried to understand what his mind had not yet accepted. He rose, twisting, and the crowd of senators pressed tighter, turning the space into a trap of fabric and limbs. Another blow landed, then another, and the sound of steel scraping bone cut through the shouts. His hands lifted defensively, fingers slicking as blood spread warm beneath the folds of his toga. For a heartbeat, he attempted control, as he always had, searching faces for an order that could stop the chaos, but there was no single commander to appeal to. This was not a riot. It was a decision executed by many hands so that no one man could be blamed alone. The room spun in fragments, white marble, red stains, sandals skidding, while his strength drained with unnatural speed. His status, his immunity, his titles collapsed into the simple fact of a wounded body failing under repeated strikes. He fell near the base of Pompey's statue, the irony too clean to be accidental, and the conspirators kept stabbing until motion ceased and certainty replaced panic. The final moments were not grand. They were compressed and ugly, breath turning shallow, vision narrowing as the world became sound and pressure. Caesar's power ended without a battlefield, without legions, without negotiation, because the Senate had found the one place he could not bring his army. And to death he became both martyr and warning, claimed by every faction that needed him to mean something. The conspirators stepped back, blades dripping, and raised their arms as if the gesture could conjure the Republic back into existence. They expected applause or relief, but the room's reaction was confusion and shock, because killing a man did not automatically restore a system. Senators fled, slaves screamed, and outside the building, Rome began to sense that something irreversible had happened without understanding what would follow. The men who had planned the deed now faced the problem they had avoided: how to control the aftermath. In the days that followed, Caesar's allies moved quickly to seize the narrative, treating his death as proof that the old elite could not tolerate reform without resorting to murder. The crowds that had benefited from his generosity did not interpret the assassination as liberation. They interpreted it as theft. Streets filled with anger and grief, and the city's mood became volatile enough that conspirators feared to appear in public. The Republic had been saved in theory, but in practice, Rome was armed with resentment and uncertainty. Calpurnia did not remain frozen in grief. She gathered his private papers and secured his fortune before rival hands could reach them, then delivered them to Mark Antony, understanding that documents could wield as much power as legions. Even in death, Caesar's authority existed in written plans and stored wealth. His household moved quickly to ensure those assets did not vanish with him. The struggle for his legacy began before his blood had dried. Months later, the vacuum did what vacuums always do in a city built on ambition. It pulled new rivals into collision. Caesar's heirs and lieutenants fought over his legacy, each claiming to protect the state while gathering soldiers and money like tools. If you're still here, like the video and subscribe, because what follows Caesar's death isn't peace or restoration. It's proof that once a republic teaches its citizens that violence resolves politics, the lesson does not die with one man. Rome descended into renewed civil war, not despite the assassination, but because of it, as alliances formed and broke with the speed of fear. Caesar's name became a banner that could justify vengeance, and the Senate's authority shrank under the pressure of armed factions that now understood the city could be taken, not merely persuaded. The conspirators had believed one death would end a crisis, yet the crisis had been structural, and blood only accelerated it. Each new battle confirmed that the Republic's old limits no longer restrained anyone who could raise legions. Years later, Octavian, young, calculating, and increasingly ruthless, consolidated power through victories and political maneuvering that made Caesar's rise look almost improvisational by comparison. He absorbed Caesar's image and authority, presenting himself as heir and restorer while steadily stripping the Republic of meaningful independence. By the time Rome accepted the new arrangement, it did so not as a choice but as exhaustion made policy. The Republic did not fall in a single day. It bled out across years of justified violence until empire felt like relief. Caesar had crossed the Rubicon to avoid humiliation and prosecution, and that choice forced Rome to decide whether law mattered more than survival. His victories proved he could seize the state, his dictatorship proved he could reshape it, and his assassination proved that fear would not tolerate him indefinitely. In the end, the Republic's defenders killed him to save their world, and in doing so, they taught Rome that a knife could end an argument faster than a vote. The empire that followed was not an accident. It was the settled condition left behind when every compromise had been made impossible.